I don't remember a single moment when I felt like I truly belonged in my own family. It wasn't something anyone ever sat me down and said directly, not in the beginning. It was quieter than that, woven into everyday life in ways that were easy to ignore if you wanted to, but impossible to unsee once you noticed. It was in the way my mother would sigh when I asked for something as simple as a new notebook for school, like I had just placed an unbearable weight on her shoulders. It was in how my father would rub his temples whenever my name came up in a conversation about expenses, muttering under his breath about too much to handle. It was in the way my siblings never had to second guess whether they deserved something, while I learned early to question every need I had. My older brother was everything my parents were proud of. He was confident, outgoing, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately be noticed. They called him their investment, their future, their success story. I watched them pour time, money, and energy into him without hesitation. Private tutors, sports equipment, anything he needed to shine brighter. My younger sister, on the other hand, was their delicate one. Sensitive, emotional, always needing protection. If she cried, the whole house stopped. If she wanted something, it was framed as a necessity for her well-being. My parents treated her like glass, careful and attentive, as if one wrong move would shatter her. And then there was me. I existed somewhere in between, but not in a balanced way. I wasn't the pride, and I wasn't the priority. I was the adjustment. The one who was expected to understand, to sacrifice, to step back without being asked twice. If there was only enough for two, it was obvious who those two would be. I learned not to compete. I learned to step aside before anyone had to tell me to. At school, I did well. Not because anyone pushed me, but because it felt like the only way to prove I wasn't just taking up space. I brought home good grades, certificates, small achievements that I hoped would finally make someone look at me the way they looked at my brother. But when I handed those papers over, the reactions were always the same. A quick nod, a distracted, "That's nice." Sometimes they didn't even look up. Once, I remember standing in the living room, holding a certificate I had worked incredibly hard for. My father was watching television, my mother busy in the kitchen. I waited, hoping one of them would notice. When they didn't, I cleared my throat and quietly said, "I came first in my class." My father glanced at me for less than a second before turning back to the screen. "That's what you're supposed to do," he said flatly. That was it. No smile, no pride, just expectation. I stood there for a moment longer, the paper trembling slightly in my hands, before I quietly walked back to my room. I didn't cry. Not anymore. I had learned that tears didn't change anything. They only made me feel weaker. Over time, I stopped sharing things altogether. My wins, my struggles, my thoughts, they stayed with me. It was easier that way. Money was always a sensitive topic in our house, but somehow it became my fault more often than not. If bills were high, if something broke, if there were unexpected expenses, my name would find its way into the conversation. "We can't afford extras because we already have too much to manage," my mother would say, her eyes flicking toward me for just a second too long. I didn't need her to say it directly. I understood. So I adapted. I wore clothes long after they stopped fitting properly. I learned how to stitch small tears myself so I wouldn't have to ask for replacements. I skipped meals occasionally, pretending I wasn't hungry when food was limited. I told myself it didn't matter, that I could handle it. And I did handle it. That became my role, the one who could handle it. But handling it didn't make it hurt any less. There were moments, small and sharp, that stayed with me more than the bigger ones. Like the time my brother got a brand new phone while I was still using an old one that barely worked. When I asked if I could get a replacement too, my father laughed, not kindly, but in disbelief. "What do you need a new phone for?" he said. "Yours works, doesn't it? Don't act like you're more important than you are." I nodded quickly, apologizing even though I wasn't sure what I had done wrong. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying his words over and over. Don't act like you're more important than you are. It became a rule I lived by. Don't ask for too much. Don't take up too much space. Don't expect too much love. By the time I reached my final years of school, I had become almost invisible in my own home. Not in a dramatic way, no one ignored me outright, but in a quieter, more permanent sense. I was included when necessary, acknowledged when convenient, and forgotten the rest of the time. And yet, a small part of me still hoped things would change. When I got accepted into a good college, it felt like a turning point. I remember staring at the acceptance letter, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and fear. This was my chance, my way out. My proof that I could be something more than what they believed I was. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine a different reaction. Maybe this time they would be proud. Maybe this time I would matter. I walked into the living room, letter in hand, trying to keep my voice steady as I shared the news. I got in, I said, unable to hide the small smile forming on my lips. My mother looked up first. Into what? She asked. I told her the name of the college, the program, the opportunity. I spoke quickly, nervously, hoping the details would impress them. My father listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When I finished, there was a brief pause that felt longer than it should have. Then he sighed. That's expensive, he said. The words hit harder than any insult. I can apply for scholarships. I added quickly. I can work part-time? We've already done enough for you. My mother interrupted, her tone firm. We can't keep stretching ourselves thin. There it was again. That familiar weight, settling on my shoulders. I nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in my throat. Okay, I said, even though nothing about it felt okay. That night, I sat on my bed with the acceptance letter in my hands. The excitement from earlier replaced by something heavier. Something quieter. But for the first time in my life, alongside the hurt, there was something else too, a realization. If I wanted a different life, I would have to build it myself. No help, no support, no safety net. Just me. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The invitation to my sister's engagement party came through a short message, sent days after everyone else had already been told in person. There was no excitement in it, no warmth, just a date, a time, and a reminder to show up early if you can help. I stared at the screen for a long time, my thumb hovering over the reply button, debating whether I even wanted to go. It had been months since I last visited home. Months of silence that felt heavier on some days and strangely peaceful on others. I had gotten used to the quiet, to not hearing my name spoken with disappointment or frustration. But something in me, something old and stubborn, still wanted to believe that maybe this time would be different. Maybe they would see me. Maybe they would finally treat me like I belonged. So I replied with a simple, I'll be there. The week leading up to the party was exhausting. I picked up extra shifts at work, just so I could afford a decent gift, something that wouldn't make me look cheap or careless. I spent hours walking through stores, comparing prices, calculating what I could and couldn't afford, until I finally settled on something elegant but modest. It cost more than I was comfortable spending, but I convinced myself it was worth it. If nothing else, I didn't want to give them another reason to look down on me. The day of the engagement party arrived faster than I expected. I stood in front of my mirror for a long time, adjusting the only dress I had that felt appropriate for the occasion. It wasn't new. It wasn't expensive, but it was clean, simple, and the best I could manage. For a brief moment, I hesitated. I could still turn back. I could pretend I was sick, or busy, or unavailable. No one would question it too much. They never did. But I pushed the thought aside, grabbed the carefully wrapped gift, and left. The house was already full by the time I arrived. Laughter spilled out through the open door, mixing with music and the clinking of glasses. It looked warm, lively, like the kind of family gathering people actually enjoyed being part of. For a second, standing at the entrance, I felt like a stranger. Then I stepped inside. No one noticed me at first. Conversations continued, people moved around me like I wasn't there. I stood awkwardly near the doorway until my mother finally spotted me from across the room. You're late, she said as she walked over, her eyes quickly scanning my outfit. Not a greeting, not even a smile. I came as soon as I could. I replied quietly, holding out the gift. This is for her. She took it without much interest. Put it on the table with the others, she said, already turning away. I nodded and did as I was told. The table was filled with expensive-looking packages, neatly arranged and decorated. Mine looked smaller, simpler, almost out of place among them. I placed it carefully in the corner, trying not to draw attention to it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of small tasks and quiet observations. I helped set up food, arranged chairs, refilled drinks, anything that kept me busy and out of the way. No one asked me to sit. No one invited me into conversations. I existed on the edges, as I always had. Every now and then, I caught snippets of praise directed at my sister. Compliments about how beautiful she looked, how lucky she was, how proud the family must be. I listened from a distance, a faint smile on my face, pretending it didn't sting. At one point, my sister walked past me, surrounded by friends and relatives. She barely glanced in my direction. "You could have dressed up a bit more," she muttered under her breath as she passed, just loud enough for me to hear. I looked down at my dress, suddenly hyper, aware of every detail. The fabric didn't feel as nice anymore. The fit didn't feel as right. I tried. I whispered, but she was already gone. I swallowed the embarrassment and kept moving. The moment that changed everything came later in the evening, when my father called for everyone's attention. The room slowly quieted as he stood near the center, a glass raised in his hand. "I just want to say a few words," he began, his voice confident, commanding. People gathered closer, their attention fully on him. I stayed where I was, near the back, half hidden behind a group of guests. He started with my sister, praising her beauty, her kindness, her ability to bring people together. His words were warm, filled with pride. She beamed beside him, soaking it all in. Then he moved on to my brother, highlighting his success, his achievements, his role as the pillar of the family. There were nods of agreement, murmurs of approval. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest as I listened. And then, almost as an afterthought, his eyes shifted in my direction. "And then there's her," he said, letting out a small laugh. The room followed his lead, a few people chuckling lightly, unsure but willing to join in. I froze. He shook his head, smiling in a way that felt anything but kind. "Well, every family has a burden to carry, I suppose." The words landed like a slap. For a second, everything went quiet, not in the room, but inside me. The laughter around me became distant, muffled. My hands tightened at my sides, my nails pressing into my palms. I looked around, hoping, just hoping, that someone would say something, that someone would step in, correct him, defend me. But no one did. Some avoided my gaze. Others looked uncomfortable but stayed silent. Most simply moved on, as if nothing significant had just happened. That was the moment something inside me broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just completely. I felt the weight of every year, every comment, every look, every quiet dismissal pressing down on me all at once. All the times I had stayed silent, convinced myself it didn't matter, told myself to be patient. For what? For this. Before I could guess myself, I stepped forward. The movement felt foreign, like I was watching someone else take control of my body. Conversation slowed as a few people noticed me approaching. My father lowered his glass slightly, confusion flickering across his face. I didn't stop until I was standing directly in front of him. The room grew quieter. My heart was racing, my chest tight, but my voice, when it came, was steady. "I'm not your burden," I said. The words hung in the air, sharp and clear. My father frowned. "What are you?" "I spent my whole life trying to be less." I continued, cutting him off before I could lose my nerve. "Less expensive, less demanding, less visible, just so I wouldn't be too much for you." A few people shifted uncomfortably. My mother's expression hardened, her eyes warning me to stop. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I did everything I could to fit into a place that never wanted me. I said, my voice trembling slightly now, but not breaking. "And I'm done pretending that's normal." My father's face darkened. "This is not the time or place." "No," I said quietly. "It's exactly the time." Silence spread through the room. "I'm not the weight you carry," I added, meeting his eyes for the first time without looking away. "You just never bothered to see my worth." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, without waiting for a response, I turned around. I didn't look at anyone as I walked toward the door. I didn't wait for someone to call my name or try to stop me. No one did. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, and only then did I realize I was shaking. My hands trembled, my breath uneven, my chest still tight with everything I had just said. But beneath all of that, there was something else. Relief. For the first time in my life, I hadn't stayed silent. For the first time I had chosen myself, I didn't go back. That night, I turned off my phone, cut every line of contact, and walked away from the only family I had ever known. And even though it hurt more than I could explain, it also felt like the beginning of something I had never had before. Freedom, the silence after I cut them off, was louder than anything I had ever experienced. At first, it felt unnatural, like something important was missing. I kept reaching for my phone out of habit, expecting a message, a call, even an argument, but there was nothing. No criticism, no guilt, no reminders of who I was supposed to be. Just quiet. The first few days were the hardest. My mind replayed everything from that night over and over again. My father's words, the laughter, the way no one had stopped me as I walked out. Doubt crept in during the late hours when I couldn't sleep. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe I should have handled it differently. Maybe, if I had just stayed silent like always, things wouldn't feel so empty. But every time those thoughts came, another memory followed. Every time I questioned my decision, I remembered the years of being overlooked, dismissed, reduced to something less than a person. And slowly, the doubt began to fade. In its place, something unfamiliar started to grow. Clarity. Without their voices filling my head, I could finally hear my own. I threw myself into work, not as an escape, but as a way to build something that was mine. I picked up extra hours, stayed late, took on responsibilities that others avoided. It wasn't easy. Some days I came home so exhausted I could barely stand, but there was a strange comfort in it. Every hour I worked, every task I completed, felt like a step away from the person they had convinced me I was. For the first time, my effort had a direction. At first, no one at work paid much attention to me. I was quiet, kept to myself, did what was asked without complaint. But consistency has a way of making itself known. Slowly, people started to notice. It began with small things. A supervisor thanking me for staying late. A coworker asking for my help with something they didn't understand. Then came bigger moments, being trusted with more responsibility, being asked for input, being included in conversations I used to stand outside of. I didn't realize how much I had been starving for simple acknowledgement until I started receiving it. The first time my manager told me, "You're doing a really good job," I didn't know how to respond. I just stood there for a second, unsure if I had heard correctly. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. But inside, something shifted. I started to believe that maybe I wasn't just capable, I was valuable. That belief didn't come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, through long days and small victories. There were still moments of insecurity. Times when I second-guessed myself or expected everything to fall apart. But each time I pushed through, the fear lost a little more of its power. Months turned into a year. I moved out of the tiny space I had been living in and into a slightly better apartment. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every small decoration, every decision about that space belonged to me. There was no one to criticize it. No one to tell me it wasn't enough. For the first time, I felt comfortable in my own environment. I also started making choices I had never allowed myself to make before. I invested in learning new skills, took online courses late at night, and pushed myself to grow in ways that had nothing to do with survival. I wasn't just trying to get by anymore. I was trying to build something meaningful. There were setbacks, of course. Moments when things didn't go as planned, when opportunities slipped through my fingers, when I felt like I was falling behind. But the difference now was that those moments didn't define me. I didn't hear my father's voice telling me I wasn't enough. I didn't hear my mother reminding me of how much I cost. I only heard myself, and for once I wasn't tearing myself down. I kept going. Eventually, the effort paid off in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. I was offered a promotion, something I had worked toward quietly, without expecting it to actually happen. When my manager told me, I felt a rush of disbelief followed by something warmer, steadier. Pride. "You've earned this," they said. The words echoed in my mind long after the conversation ended. Earned this. No one had ever said that to me before. With the promotion came better pay, more responsibility, and more opportunities. I handled it all with a determination that surprised even me. I wasn't just doing the job, I was excelling at it. And for the first time in my life, success didn't feel like something fragile that could be taken away at any moment. It felt solid, real, mine. As the years passed, my life continued to change in quiet but powerful ways. I built connections with people who respected me, who valued my time and my presence. They weren't tied to me by obligation or blood, they chose to be part of my life, and I chose them in return. That difference meant everything. I also learned to take care of myself in ways I never had before. Not just physically, but emotionally. I allowed myself to rest without guilt, to enjoy small moments without feeling like I didn't deserve them. I stopped measuring my worth by how little space I took up. I started taking up space unapologetically. One evening, after a long day at work, I sat in my apartment, looking around at everything I had built. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt peaceful. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who stood in the background, waiting to be noticed, trying to shrink herself into something acceptable. I barely recognized her. Not because she was weak, but because she had never been given the chance to see her own strength. Now, I saw it clearly. And with that clarity came something even more powerful. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed to prove anything to them. I had spent years believing that my worth was something they could give or take away. But standing there, in a life I had built on my own, I finally understood the truth. My worth had never been theirs to decide. It had always been mine. And the girl they once called a burden had become someone they wouldn't even recognize anymore. Not because she had changed into something else, but because she had finally become who she was always meant to be. Strong, capable, unstoppable. It started with a message from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Unknown numbers usually meant nothing important. Spam, wrong numbers, things that had nothing to do with me. But something about the timing made me pause. It had been years since I cut them off, years of silence so complete that I had stopped expecting it to ever break. Still, my thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before I opened it. "Hey, it's Mom." Just those 3 words. For a second, my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't pain exactly. It was something deeper, something older, like a memory trying to come back to life. I stared at the message, unsure what I was supposed to feel. There was no apology, no explanation, just an opening, as if the years between us didn't exist. I locked my phone without replying. But the silence didn't last. Another message came later that evening, then another the next day. Short at first. Careful testing. "We need to talk, please respond. It's important." I read every message and answered none of them. Part of me wanted to ask why now. Why after all this time? Why when I had finally built something stable? Something peaceful. But I already knew the answer without needing to hear it. People like them didn't come back because they suddenly understood your worth. They came back because they needed something. The calls started a few days later. I watched my phone light up with the same number over and over again. My name probably flashing on their screen the same way theirs was on mine. The difference was, I didn't feel the same urgency to answer anymore. I had learned how to live without them. Eventually, the calls stopped. For a while, everything went quiet again. I thought that was the end of it, that they had given up, moved on, accepted the distance the same way I had. I was wrong. It was a Saturday afternoon when the knock came at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I rarely did. My life had settled into a routine that didn't leave much room for surprises, and I preferred it that way. The knock came again, louder this time. I walked toward the door slowly, a strange sense of unease settling in my chest. Something about it didn't feel normal. It wasn't the quick, casual knock of a delivery or a neighbor. It was persistent. I opened the door, and everything I thought I had left behind was suddenly standing right in front of me. My mother looked older than I remembered. Not just physically, but in a way that seemed to weigh down her entire presence. The confidence she used to carry so easily was gone, replaced by something uncertain. My father stood beside her, quieter than I had ever seen him. His posture was different, less rigid, less certain of itself. And behind them, my brother and sister lingered, both avoiding my eyes. For a moment, no one spoke. We just stood there, staring at each other like strangers who shared a past they didn't know how to acknowledge. "You're not answering your phone," my mother said finally, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. I didn't respond. I didn't invite them in either. "What are you doing here?" I asked instead. They exchanged a glance. The kind of silent communication I used to be excluded from. "We need to talk," my father said, repeating the same words from the messages, but without the authority he once carried. I studied him for a moment, searching for something familiar. But whatever version of him I had grown up fearing, it wasn't standing here anymore. "About what?" I asked. Another pause. Then my brother stepped forward slightly, his voice hesitant. "Things have been difficult." Difficult. The word felt small, almost meaningless. "How?" I asked, my tone calm but firm. They didn't answer right away. It was my sister who spoke next, her voice quieter than I remembered. "The business failed," she said. "There were debts. A lot of them." My brother looked away, jaw tightening. "My marriage didn't work out," she added after a moment. "I had to move back home." "And your parents?" I asked, glancing between them. My mother let out a shaky breath. "We've been trying to manage everything, but it's too much." I listened without interrupting, my expression unreadable. This was the part where I was supposed to feel something, wasn't it? Sympathy, concern, guilt. But all I felt was distance. They continued explaining financial problems, failed investments, pressure mounting from every direction. The details blurred together, forming a picture that was clear enough without needing every piece. Everything had fallen apart, and now they were here. When they finished, the silence that followed was heavier than anything they had said. My father shifted uncomfortably before finally speaking again. "We were wrong about you." The words were simple, but they carried something unfamiliar, hesitation, maybe even regret. I held his gaze, waiting. "You've done well for yourself," he continued, his voice slower, less certain. "We heard about your job. Your success." Of course they had. Success had a way of reaching people who never cared to listen before. My mother stepped closer, her eyes searching my face. "We didn't realize. You didn't try to," I interrupted quietly. She flinched slightly, but didn't argue. Another silence stretched between us. Then came the part I had been expecting from the moment I saw them standing there. "We need your help," my brother said, his voice low. There it was. Not, "We miss you." Not, "We're sorry." Not, "We want to fix things." "We need your help." I let the words settle in the air, taking my time before responding. "What kind of help?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Financial," my father said, the word clearly difficult for him to say. "Just until we get back on our feet. Just." As if it were small, temporary, insignificant. My sister stepped in quickly, her tone more urgent. "You're doing well now. We know you are. This wouldn't be a problem for you?" Wouldn't be a problem. I almost smiled at that. For years, I had been the problem. Now I was the solution. I leaned slightly against the doorframe, crossing my arms as I looked at them. Really looked at them. The same people who once made me feel like I was too much were now standing in front of me, asking me to carry their weight. The irony wasn't lost on me. For a brief moment, something old stirred inside me. A familiar pull. The part of me that had spent years trying to earn their approval, their acceptance, their love. It whispered quietly, telling me this was my chance. My chance to finally be seen, to finally matter in their eyes. But that voice didn't have the same power it once did. Because I had learned something in the years without them. Being needed wasn't the same as being valued, and I refused to confuse the two again. I straightened slightly, my voice calm, steady. "I see," I said. They waited, watching me closely. Hope flickering in their expressions. And for the first time, I realized something that shifted the balance completely. I wasn't standing in front of them as the girl they used to dismiss. I was standing there as someone they depended on. And that changed everything. They were still standing there, waiting. Hope has a very specific look when it sits on the faces of people who never expected to need you. It's fragile, almost uncomfortable, like it doesn't quite belong. I could see it in the way my mother's hands twisted together, in how my brother avoided my eyes, in the tight set of my father's jaw as if he was holding himself together by force. For a moment, no one spoke. I let the silence stretch, not to punish them, but because I needed it. I needed a second to stand fully in who I had become, without letting the past rush in and make decisions for me. A version of me from years ago would have already said yes. She would have invited them in, sat them down, offered tea, and reassured them that everything would be okay. She would have ignored the way her chest tightened, the way her stomach dropped, just to feel like she finally belonged. But that version of me didn't exist anymore. I can't help you, I said. The words were calm, simple, final. For a second, they didn't react, as if the sentence hadn't fully registered. Then my mother blinked, her expression shifting into confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice thin. "I mean exactly what I said," I replied, meeting her eyes without hesitation. "I'm not going to give you money." The air changed immediately. My brother's head snapped up. "Are you serious?" he said, disbelief creeping into his tone. "After everything, we're family." Family. The word echoed in my mind, heavy with years of expectations that had never applied to them when it came to me. I tilted my head slightly. "We were family when I needed support too," I said quietly. "Do you remember how that went?" He didn't answer. My sister stepped forward, her frustration more visible now. "That's different," she said quickly. "Things were tight back then. We didn't have a choice." I held her gaze, steady and unshaken. "There's always a choice," I said. "You just didn't choose me." That landed. I could see it in the way her expression faltered, the way her shoulders stiffened. But instead of acknowledging it, she looked away. My father finally spoke again, his voice lower than before, but still carrying a trace of that old authority. "We're not asking for charity," he said. "We're asking for help. You're in a position to give it." I almost laughed at that, but there was nothing funny about it. "For years, I was in a position to need it," I replied. "And you made it very clear what I was worth to you." "That's not fair," my mother said quickly, her voice trembling now. "We did what we could." "No," I said gently, but firmly. "You did what you wanted." The truth sat heavily between us. Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't look away. Not this time. I had spent too many years softening my reality to protect their feelings. I wasn't going to do that anymore. "We made mistakes," she whispered. "We're admitting that now. Isn't that enough?" I shook my head slowly. "Admitting it now doesn't erase what happened," I said. "And it doesn't give you access to my life again like nothing changed." My brother let out a frustrated breath, running a hand through his hair. "So that's it?" he snapped. "You're just going to turn your back on us?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I learned that from you," I said. Silence. Real silence this time, the kind that doesn't leave room for argument. My sister's eyes filled with tears, but there was anger behind them. "You've changed?" she said, like it was an accusation. I nodded slightly. I had to. Another pause stretched out, heavier than before. My father looked at me differently now, not with authority, not even with expectation, but with something closer to realization. Like he was finally seeing the result of everything they had done, standing right in front of him. "You'd really let us struggle," he said quietly. The question wasn't loud, but it carried weight. I took a slow breath before answering. "I struggled," I said. "Lone." No one spoke after that. The truth didn't need anything added to it. For a moment, I thought my mother might say something else, might try one last time to reach me. But instead, she lowered her gaze, her shoulders sinking in a way I had never seen before. They were out of words. And maybe, for the first time, they understood that I was too. I shifted slightly, my hand resting on the edge of the door. "I hope you figure things out," I said, my voice softer now, but no less firm. "I really do." It wasn't cruel, it wasn't sarcastic. It was honest. But it wasn't an invitation. They didn't move at first. It was like they were waiting for something, for me to change my mind, to soften, to call them back. I didn't. Eventually, my brother turned away, his expression tight with frustration. My sister followed, wiping at her face. My mother hesitated for a second longer, her eyes lingering on mine, as if she was searching for something she used to recognize. But whatever she was looking for, it wasn't there anymore. My father was the last to move. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before turning and walking away without another word. And just like that, they were gone. I stood there for a moment after they left, my hands still on the door, my heart beating steadily in my chest. I expected to feel something overwhelming: guilt, regret, sadness. But what I felt instead was something quieter, lighter. I closed the door gently, the soft click echoing through the apartment. The silence returned, wrapping around me the same way it had in the beginning. Only now, it felt different. It didn't feel empty. It felt like peace. I walked back inside, taking in the space around me, the life I had built piece by piece, without anyone's permission, without anyone's approval. For years, I had believed that being a burden meant I had to earn my place in the world, that I had to prove I was worth the space I took up. But standing there, in a life that was entirely my own, I finally understood something I wish I had known much earlier. I was never the burden. I was just surrounded by people who didn't know how to value me. And the moment I stopped trying to convince them otherwise was the moment everything changed. I moved forward, not looking back, not second guessing myself. Because I didn't need their recognition anymore. I didn't need their acceptance. And I definitely didn't need their approval. They had spent years underestimating me, reducing me to something small, something insignificant. But that was their mistake, not mine. Because being underestimated wasn't where my story ended. It was where it began. And the day they showed up at my door, asking for what they once refused to give, was the day I realized just how far I had come. Not because they needed me, but because I no longer needed them.